Welcome back. The Wall Street Journal is out with new reporting from behind the scenes at the White House entitled, "Despite his public bravado, President Trump is grappling with his own fears regarding Iran." According to the Journal, the operation to extract two airmen whose jet was shot down over Iran this month was followed by hours of the president screaming at aides, quote, "Images of the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, one of the biggest international policy failures of a presidency in recent times, had been looming large in his mind." The paper reports the president is dealing with his own fear about ordering troops into harm's way. Trump has resisted sending American soldiers to take Kharg Island, for example, the launch point for 90% of Iran's oil exports. While he was told the mission would succeed and the territory's capture would give the U.S. access to the strait, he worried there would be unacceptably high American casualties. Still, he has made risky pronouncements without input from his national security team, including his post about plans to destroy the Iranian civilization, saying seeming unstable could help spur the Iranians to negotiate. A president who thrives on drama is bringing an even more intense version of his unorthodox, maximalist approach to a new situation, fighting a war. He is veering between belligerent and conciliatory approaches and grappling behind the scenes with just how badly things could go wrong. Joining us now, the co-author of that piece, White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Annie Linskey. So, Annie, what else are you hearing about the president's feelings about this behind the scenes? It seems to match pretty well or track pretty well with the way Iran is responding, which anybody with a sense of how things go with Iran is not surprised about.
Yeah, Micah, my colleague Josh Dawsey and I set out to try to draw a portrait of the president at war. Donald Trump has had two presidencies, but he has never overseen a sustained military campaign like this. And while we, as Americans, have seen his very unique governing style in other aspects of his presidency, legislating, executive orders, and the like, we've never witnessed this type of sort of impulsive and his sort of desire to appear chaotic during wartime. So that was what we were trying to show and the reporting target that we had for this piece.
Annie, one of the things I thought was really fascinating about your piece was how there seem to be two parallel tracks happening that are not necessarily communicating with each other all the time in the White House. So you've got, during the operation to try and rescue the airmen, you've got the security people keeping Donald Trump away from the situation because they thought he might make it more complicated. But then at the same time, you've also got the president on his own track launching truth socials about ending a civilization, for example, or praise be to Allah on Easter morning, without negotiation and clearing those posts and going through the posts with his national security team. So how much is it the president just launching things, and how much is it the national security team actually running the operation in the White House?
Yeah, those tweets, or I should say those Truth Social posts that took so many people off guard who woke up and read them, about ending a civilization, saying, praise be to Allah on Easter Sunday of all days. Those were not tweets that he had even sort of chatted with his national security team about. They read them much the way we did after they were posted. The president did ask his staff about those tweets and said, how are they playing? What am I being criticized? And his staff said, yes, sir, you are. You're facing quite a bit of criticism for them. Some of his members of his national security team read them and weren't as alarmed by them as many others were. They said, look, they felt that he was communicating the way the Iranians do. The Iranians have for years said, death to America, and believed perhaps this would get through to them in a way that the more restrained language that we're used to from a president perhaps has not. But you're right, that wasn't something that was being workshopped within the White House. As to there was a long call that was open when the 2 airmen were down behind enemy lines, and that is an instance where the staff were updating the president frequently, but they didn't want him to be on that line. They were concerned that he was so impatient as he was watching those developments that they didn't have him doing the minute-to-minute call. But to be fair, to be sure, he was being updated regularly in that weekend when those airmen were down.
Jonathan, off of what Annie just said about the president doing this, to speak in a way the Iranians understood, I have heard from Arab leaders in the region, several over the past year, that they actually, I'm just reporting, they actually like the fact, as one told me after these posts, that the mullahs now have to deal with someone who is, quote, crazier than they are. Other diplomats across the region have said he actually thinks like an Arab leader. He doesn't think like an American leader. Donald Trump thinks and talks like the sort of leaders that we grew up with. And if that throws the Iranians off, you Americans may not understand this, but we're totally fine with it, which I found to be fascinating. Yes, I do have a problem with it. I have a problem with all of it. That said, even this past week, I heard again, as I've been hearing for a year, he's the only American president that can strike fear in the hearts of Iranians.
Yeah,
well, and I would say, and also in the hearts of everybody that lives in Washington and across America.
Yeah, no question there. White House aides, as Annie reported, anxious at the time. A lot of them since that post have said, well, it worked. Look, they got Iran to agree to the ceasefire. Like, these sets up the table for negotiations, like sort of defending it in retrospect. The madman theory, if you will, that you just outlined, Joe, that it's impossible to predict Trump, so therefore you have to fear the worst. And that's all this was, art of the deal, that stuff. We'll see. But Annie, the other thing that your story illustrates well is, though Trump this time, second term, far more likely to authorize military force than in the first, but he's still hesitant to cross a threshold of deploying ground troops. He's still very nervous about American lives lost, in themselves would be terrible, but also the political ramifications of that. So speak to us about that still, that hesitation, and what we could learn from it as we consider what could come next, because the fate of these negotiations is still very much in doubt. Trump may need to escalate further and actually to get this war to close if it can't be done on the negotiating table in Islamabad the next couple of days.
Yeah, I was really struck in talking to some of the people around the president and his advisors and some of his informal advisors, the extent to which he has brought up in conversations Jimmy Carter and how Jimmy Carter's experience in Iran, this exact regime that the President Trump has been bombing, but how Jimmy Carter's experience in Iran has loomed large as he's been weighing what to do. And he has even spoken, the president has spoken publicly about this in a March event in Florida. He brought up Jimmy Carter as he was talking about he was ticking off Democratic failures in foreign policy, but he dwelled at length about Jimmy Carter, something that his friends have said and people who have spoken to him have said he has talked about privately as well. So his hesitance on putting troops on the ground is real. He's very concerned about how that would be. He has not been in a position before of sending troops in harm's way in this way. That is not to say he won't do it. And his advisors have been very clear with us that remains on the table. It's not something that they're going to take off. But he has said, troops going to Kyrgyz Island, would they be sitting ducks? Would they all be killed? And that is a very real fear that he has articulated.
And for good reason. And Annie, I couldn't help but notice the picture that accompanied your story, at least when I read it online, had so many parallels with the failed 1980 Operation Eagle Claw, the failed operation to rescue the Iranian hostages back in 1980. Obviously, that parallel haunts the president, doesn't it?
It really does. It's something that we have heard he talks about extensively. And this is a time in his life when he was coming of age. He paid close attention to the news, as we know. But he would be one of he is one of 7 presidents to be bedeviled by this national security threat that Iran has faced. And he has thought about how other presidents have attempted to handle it and failed. So it is on his mind.
All right, White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Annie Linskey, thank you very much for your reporting. The new reporting is available to read online right now.